Have you heard of the 5 stages of grief? I'm pretty sure you have. But did you know that those 5 stages of grief bear no resemblance whatsoever to actual real grief? Let's talk about it. So if you have heard anything about grief, it probably had something to do with those 5 stages of grief, right? I bet you can name them, even if I have to sometimes work to remember them. There's denial, there's bargaining, there's anger, there's depression, and there is acceptance, right? The holy grail of all things grief is that you reach that stage of acceptance and everything goes back to normal. None of that is true. But if we don't have some kind of order for grief, does that mean that we're just kind of screwed, honestly, that we're just left alone with our feelings? We're going to be sad and depressed and miserable for the rest of our lives when something difficult happens? No. The truth is that there's a big middle ground in there, and it's called being human. So in today's video, we are going to talk about those 5 stages of grief, what they were used for, what the goal was, what it's really like in real life, trying to fit a human process into a structure that is completely made up, and what you can do to find some sort of order inside your grief that actually makes sense as a human being, not a set of rules. Let's talk about what normal means, right? Because a lot of the times what we hear when we're talking about grief is, first of all, the new normal, and friends or family, or even you yourself putting some pressure on yourself that you need to get back to normal. There is no normal, right? There's no life to go back to. There is no you without whatever it is you've lost. And that's not a downer, that's the truth. Normal is a moving point of balance. It is a constantly changing phenomenon. What is normal for you today might not be normal for you tomorrow. This insistence on normal also isn't helpful. So we've got the 5 stages of grief that aren't helpful. We've got our insistence on normal or a new normal, also not a helpful term. Normal is what is typical for you in this new life that is unfolding and unfolding and unfolding. Let's talk about the history of the stages of grief for a minute. There's sort of this rule book that we have saturated into culture and movies and books and pop psychology, but what are they really? The 5 stages of grief were created by Dr. Elisabeth Kübler-Ross in the late 70s, I think. They were actually something that she found working with people who had just received a terminal diagnosis. She never meant them to be concrete things that you have to go through. She never meant them to go in order. She also never meant them to be required parts of adjusting to a terminal diagnosis. Notice what I said there, a terminal diagnosis. What Dr. Kübler-Ross was seeing was these patients that she was working with as they received a terminal diagnosis, as they came to terms with their own impending death. They felt some things. She meant those stages as a way to make a wholly disorienting time have some anchors in it, have some markers of what makes sense for you to be feeling when you're facing your own mortality. Now, what happened, unfortunately, is that medical profession, the culture, the therapists, the nurses, the doctors, they ran with that and they said, hey, grief is this really uncomfortable giant thing that feels messy and uncomfortable and unpredictable. Let's put some order on it. And so they took those 5 things that somebody might feel when they're facing their own mortality and turned them into a system by which we measure all grief. There are 5 stages. You must go through them in order. If you're not doing your grief work correctly, you are failing the stages. And it's not just that. Some of those stages are better than others, right? We understand that you might have a little bit of bargaining. Bargaining is when you're sort of arguing with the universe. If only you let my person live, if only you let the test results come back the way that I want them to, I promise to be good, right? It's ridiculous when you look at it this way. It's this like vending machine world where if you do all of the right things, you get the results you want. So that's bargaining. Depression, right? Sort of resigned to your fate. Everything is terrible. Everything is gloomy anyway. There is anger. Anger is my favorite in this made-up system. Anger is the one that we see somebody being angry in their grief, in their loss, whatever they're coming to terms with, and we say, anger is normal and healthy, just don't get stuck there. Don't get stuck in your anger, right? Anger is allowed, but only a tiny bit, and then you need to move on because we really need you to get to that acceptance piece, right? We really need you to do this correctly and do it quickly so that you go back to normal, which is really just code for stop being sad in my face because it makes me uncomfortable. I know that I can sound really cranky about it, and sometimes I am really cranky about it, because the stages of grief are this way of simplifying this complex human condition, this complex human experience that we all go through in different ways at different times. We like things to be simple. We don't like things to be complicated. And we don't like to feel helpless in the face of pain, any kind of pain. And those handy-dandy stages make us feel like we got this. We know what to do. We know what to expect. We know what to expect of ourselves. And we know what to offer to somebody else when we see them struggling. Hey, it sounds like you're in denial. Maybe you should do this. Hey, you're being really angry and I know that's normal, but you really need to get acceptance. It's this way of controlling and judging, honestly, this messy, amorphous, very human condition, which honestly, I get it. It makes sense. It's hard to see somebody you love having a hard time. It's hard to feel like you know what to do about it. So anytime I see the stages of grief mentioned in a book or in a movie, especially in movies, or in like a major media newspaper article or online article, what really irks me about that is that your friends and family are gonna read that, and that reinforces that there is a right and a wrong way for you to be living your life. There's a right and a wrong way to respond in grief, and that's just not true. So those stages of grief really enforce this misunderstanding that we have with ourselves and with each other, that there is something right or wrong about being human. There's nothing right or wrong about being human. It's just us. So I think what really happens is that we have the stages of grief. We have this sort of transformation idea of any kind of hardship. Something crappy happens to you. If you do your work correctly, you come out bigger and better and stronger at the end. Those stages of grief are just part of that transformation storyline. Crappy things happen, yes, but they happen to teach you a lesson. And if you do your grief work correctly, you come out better, stronger, wiser, more resilient, carrying with you lessons that you couldn't have learned any other way. How rude! How rude. Crappy things happen all the time. Beautiful things do too, but we're better with the beautiful things than we are with the difficult things. We say to somebody who's grieving, yeah, do your grief, feel your feelings, but don't stay stuck there. This is gonna change, this is gonna get better. Can you imagine if we did that with happiness? Don't stay stuck in your happiness. Things are gonna change, right? When you flip it, you can really hear how ridiculous it is, some of the things that we say to somebody going through a hard time. I get it. We haven't been taught the right tools to really be supportive of somebody going through a hard time. So of course we reach for these tools that we've been sort of force-fed over the last 40 or 50 years. Yeah, we reach for things that wouldn't work for us when they've been applied to us. Nobody likes to be judged for what they're going through, but we turn that around and we use these old tools that we've inherited just because we don't know what else to do. And that's where I come in. This is what I have spent the last over a decade doing, is helping people understand that the things we habitually do, the things we've been taught to do when somebody's going through a hard time, they don't actually work. But that doesn't mean we're just helpless in the face of everything. If we throw out those stages of grief, it doesn't mean we have nothing. It just means that we've got to expand our ideas of what it is to be human, what it is to lose things, what it is to be in pain, and what it is to need each other. We don't need a narrow little set of rules to love each other and to show up. What we need is more of a generous, inclusive awkwardness. So let's go back to those stages of grief for a minute. Dr. Elisabeth Kübler-Ross created those rules as a guide, as a comfort to people going through a really difficult time in 1969. Grief existed before 1969. Sometimes people think that I'm dissing her work. Absolutely not. She was a pioneer of her time. I can totally geek out on the history of why we've been so pain avoidant from the dawn of human history right up until today. But the important part for today is that her work pushed the boundaries of what was acceptable in the decades that she grew up in. No one was talking about death. No one was talking about grief. You didn't air your dirty laundry. Everything was great. Everything was happy all the time, even more so than it is today. She revolutionized the way that we talk about the human experience. We have grown beyond those reductive terms that were so powerful in her time. We've changed, we're different. We know more about what it is to be human, to be hurt, to be suffering, to talk about what's really going on for ourselves and in ourselves and with each other. We can do this. We don't need to use the tools that made sense 50 years ago. We can grow and adapt and become even more human and even more helpful. And I can get super poetic about all of that stuff, which is sometimes helpful and sometimes not. But there's a realistic, practical way to approach grief for yourself and approach grief when you see it in somebody else. Again, remember that I said that just because we throw out these old reductive stages, linear model, feel this on time and this over here, like just because we throw those out doesn't mean there's nothing to do. So if you're going through something that's difficult, that could be a loss due to a death, it could be a chronic illness, it could be any number of things. If you're going through a grieving process, I think the first thing to remember is that there's nothing wrong with you. Don't underestimate the power of not feeling like you're doing it wrong. I didn't say that great, but we do this thing because we have those five stages of grief, because we have toxic positivity, because we have good vibes only. When you're not matching that happiness ideal, you can feel like the problem yourself. So don't underestimate the power of acknowledging that you are a human being having a human experience and you feel how you feel. Don't underestimate the power of that. So that's thing one. You're not doing it wrong. Maybe it's messy, it's probably painful, but you're not wrong. You will feel a million different things. Those 5 stages of grief, you might feel some of those, right? You might be angry. You might be in denial. Denial is really just a code word for I need a distraction. Denial is really a positive thing in some ways. It means that your brain, your nervous system can't take in the totality of what this loss brings to you or means to you or is, right? So denial is actually not a bad thing. You might move through 19 different emotions in 10 minutes. Uncomfortable? Yes. But weird? No. Whatever you feel inside your grief is correct. Just because it doesn't feel good doesn't make it wrong. If you're trying to support somebody else who's going through grief, all those things that I just said, they also apply. Remember that whatever your grieving person is going through is normal. It is uncomfortable. It is hard to watch. It is hard to feel helpless in the face of somebody else's pain. Your job, though, is to notice that you're feeling helpless. Recognize your instinct or your impulse to jump right there and make it better for them. Maybe you reach for those stages of grief to say, this is denial, it's perfectly normal, and you should move on to the... If you reach for those tools that we've been taught, chances are pretty good you're gonna miss your mark. It's not a bad thing to want to help somebody that you care about. I want you to slow down your impulse to help and think about, oh, I'm feeling helpless in the face of this person's pain. I really want to take that pain away. I can't do that though. My job is to feel helpless and awkward and show up anyway. All you really need to remember, friends, is don't try to fix your person's pain for them. If you just remember their grief is not a problem to be solved, your job is not to fix things for somebody, but to support them exactly where they are, you're gonna do fine.